All right, here we are. Kevin Allison, host of Risk. Welcome. It's really good to chat with you, man. You're a guy who listens to stories. I want to hear your story.
Oh, shit. Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So, first of all, how long have you been doing Risk? You're an OG podcaster, aren't you?
Yeah, we started in 2009. And at the time, I had not... A friend of mine, challenged me to tell a true story on stage because I had been doing character. I'd been doing sketch comedy so long and doing big, broad characters. And a friend of mine said, I think your own life is so crazy. It would be fun if you just got up on stage and told a true story. And I said, that feels so risky. And he said, cling to that word because that's a good sign,
Right.
So I thought, okay, well, what's the riskiest story I could possibly tell? And at the time, I thought it was the first time I tried prostituting myself when I was 23 years old. It was a very short-lived profession for me. It was basically like 1 week, and then I was like, no, I'm not cut out for that.
Well, at least it wasn't for lack of clients.
Yeah. It was more like, oh my gosh, I'm not that good of an actor, I guess. There's a certain amount of acting that is required for that.
Right.
But yeah, I told this story in front of a live audience at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater. And the energy I felt that night was so different from what I was used to feeling on stage. Literally being able to forget where the fuck I was and ask the audience, wait, where was I? And, you're in conversation when you're telling a true story as opposed to all this memorized silliness or whatever. And I just felt really lit up walking away from the show that night. And I thought, okay, this is what I can do. I can combat a decade's worth of stage fright and social anxiety and being afraid of other comedians because, I had been in this sketch comedy group in the early 90s and had since pretty much lost my career. And I was like, what I can do is I can create this show, call it Risk, and have people tell true stories that really forces themselves outside of their comfort zone. And people can come out about anything, and that'll be it. And I was unfamiliar with The Moth. I had heard a little bit of This American Life, but I was suspecting, I was like, there's probably a niche in there where I could have more uncensored stories. And sure enough, I started listening to This American Life, and I heard Ira Glass give a trigger warning before a story where he said, I have to warn the audience, the following story acknowledges the existence of sex. And I was like, there you go. There's a niche that can definitely be filled. A show that doesn't have to give that insane warning.
Oh, man. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
I remember listening. I was listening to Terry Gross once, on NPR, and she said, she was interviewing this guy, and he had written a book, and she kept referring to the book as the Chicken S-Word Crew. And I thought, what a dumb name for a book, And she interviewed this guy for 20 minutes or something, and it was like about, a stock brokerage firm or something. And, of course, the name of his book was The Chicken Shit Crew. But the whole time she's saying the Chicken S-Word Crew. I was like, what the fuck is going on with this woman? Oh, my God. Yeah, well, yeah. I'm glad you saw that. In 2009, I mean, how many podcasts existed? I started in 2010, and I feel like I was one of the, originals.
Yeah. It was definitely good timing. It was because, after that, the deluge. I heard you talking on a Daniele Bolelli podcast at one point, and the two of you were talking about how now you feel like you have to keep coming up with podcasts, keep throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what gets listeners because everyone's attention is so scattered. Yeah, so it's we keep plugging away at it. And there is an interesting trend that someone told us about. Someone said that there are now advertising networks for podcasts are talking about, we're getting a little tired of constantly chasing the new shiny thing. Maybe we should pay a little bit more attention to shows that have been around for a long time and maintained a pretty consistent audience, you know? Because it's hard after all these years to feel like you're not still growing. We're still doing all kinds of experimentation format-wise, but we wish we were reaching a wider audience, and unfortunately, the solution that we've come at is, well, maybe we should make a family-friendly version of the show, you know?
Right.
We might end up doing that. Yeah. It's kind of crazy. A lot of people are a bit afraid of risk because they don't know if someone will be eating shit or eating people or.
Yeah.
But the truth is, like, there's so many stories on the show where nothing super graphic or challenging happens. It's just the high stakes are the emotions that the person had, you know, in what was going on in their life.
Right.
It's all like peak experience kind of stuff, you know, whether it's low lows or high highs.
Yeah, I was going to ask what obviously, the question everyone must ask you, what makes a good story, you know, but is it just the extremity of the experience, or are you also looking for people who are particularly good at telling stories, have a distinctive voice?
Yeah, we do a lot of workshopping with people and a lot of pulling things out. The number one thing, and you told an amazing, like an all-time Risk classic, and it's got a title which is like the theme of our entire series. It's Outside the Comfort Zone.
Right.
And that's a perfect example. That story is maybe 25 or 30 minutes long, I forget. But it was a matter of me just continuing to poke and prod at you. Okay, then what sort of bodily sensation did you feel? Okay, then what thought ran through your head? Because people tend to generalize and summarize, but you know that thing called EDMR? It's
right.
Where a person
Whispering.
is following not ASMR. A person's following a bouncing light, which is like a hypnotic anchor, and then the therapist is asking them all these sensory questions about something traumatic that happened to them. So that's very similar to what we do. We just keep poking and prodding about, okay, but what was the temperature like at that point? And what was the expression on that person's face? Because the more you get into that kind of stuff, it's just like sense memory with actors. You start to really re-experience it again when you get into that level of intimacy. So
I always send people to that recording. I've told that story on Rogan's podcast and on my own podcast, whatever. But I always tell people, if you want to hear the best version of this story, go to Risk, and I send them the link to it. Because you really, and this is something I wanted to talk to you about, you didn't just say to me, tell the story. You did what you interrogated the story, and you pulled, as you've just described, you pulled detail out of me. And I had told that story a bunch of times. I'm a fucking loudmouth, storyteller. That's my thing, right? But you helped me tell that story much better than I ever had before. And then you guys added sound effects, and you really do a good job.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a perfect example because you were on LSD in that story, right?
Yeah.
People tend to just use generic descriptions of like what their LSD experience was like and quickly go through it, but there are some weird, unique little idiosyncrasies to people's different experiences with that sort of thing. So when you really ask them, no, wait, what were you really thinking then? Or what did things sound like around you? Then it can start to really bring things alive. And that story is that's a perfect example of such a high-stakes story. You thought you were going to die. And kind of went through a little bit of the psychological steps of accepting possibly dying. And so that's about as high stakes as it gets. And so it's well worth kind of slowing down time. There's that Hitchcock thing where he said, when you get to the boring parts of the story, just speed up the storytelling. When you get to the intense shit, slow that stuff down. Like, 95 shots for the shower scene,
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So it sounds like your acting background really informs the way you approach this podcast as a host. That you're coaching people in a way.
Yeah, probably unconsciously a lot of it. Like, I think I picked up a lot over the years of story structure and the use of, I guess, the voice and all of that in sharing experiences. And like I said, the whole sense memory thing, yeah, all of that kind of does come into it. Because there are people, there was a fellow once who told a story, and I didn't record it, someone else on our team recorded it, where he tried to sail around the world, right, in a little, sailboat, and ended up near Indonesia, had a stroke, and was just laying flat on his back in his boat, thinking he was going to die because he couldn't move like most of his body. The boat is boarded by pirates, and they're looting it, taking all his stuff. One of the pirates has an 8-year-old boy, and the boy says, can't we at least take this guy to the shore? So they do. They take him to the shore, and there someone finds him and takes him to a hospital. It's such a remarkable story, but he just could not tell it with any emotion. He couldn't tap into the nitty-gritty of how it really felt. And, there's a way that NPR deals with that sort of thing. That is that they'll have the host of the show come on and tell the story for them. The host will come on and be like, it was really getting down to the wire for so-and-so, and so we try to avoid that. But there are cases where we're thinking of maybe doing that sometimes now because for example, we got this story from a gal who she was into party drugs when she was about 15. Typical MDMA and that kind of stuff. And her parents sent her away to a Christian boarding school in the wilderness, somewhere in Michigan or Wisconsin or something like that. And it was major Handmaid's Tale, major abuse happening at this school. And we've just had the hardest time with her because she's clearly still so traumatized, even though this was 15 years ago, that she really just has a hard time just getting it out.
Yeah.
And so we're thinking, well, we've been always so open to changing things format-wise and experimenting. So maybe we will leave some room for doing what NPR does sometimes with that sort of thing.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of people have great stories, but they don't know how to tell them.
Yeah.
Or there's an emotional block to flowing through the telling of the story, of course. So if they give you permission, that's performing it possibly a very healing service for a person.
Oh my God, yeah. It was so funny because the first ever episode of Risk was called Strange Sex. And at that time, we were brand new, and so I just put up on Craigslist. Anyone out there have a strange sex story you want to share on our podcast?
Who doesn't?
And there was this gal that I sat down with, she might have been the very first person I ever recorded for the show. We're sitting opposite each other in this room at NYU that I had access to. And she was like, oh my gosh, there was this crazy weekend when I was in college at this frat house where all this sexual stuff happened. And as she's going through the story, I saw her eyes start to glaze over. And I started to realize, oh shit, she's realizing this story is not as funny as she thought it was. She some of this shit is kind of haunting her right now. So right there, I just had the instinct after we finished recording that to say, you know what, I'm going to send you this recording. Yeah. We don't have to run it on the show. You get back to us if you feel like you would like us to continue exploring it. And that's happened many times. There have been, just recently we did shows in Portland and Seattle, and there was a gal who pitched us, and we were ready to start working with her, but then when we started working with her, we realized, she needs more time with this. And so we'll tell people that. We'll tell people, hey, why don't you share this recording with close loved ones, a therapist, or whatnot. See what it's like to come back to it a year or two later. And people have done that and come back with extraordinary stories. It's a balancing act.
Right. I imagine you must get into some complicated ethical spaces, which you're sort of touching on here. But have you had stories that you've, I don't know, what do you say, published or posted or whatever, that you regretted, that you felt like, ooh, you know what, that's gone wrong somehow?
Yeah, we've been re-releasing our original episodes on Thursdays, and it's been kind of interesting because hearing some of these stories again and realizing, that story doesn't have as much compassion toward the other characters in it as it should. It was very funny because during the course of Risk's existence is when I kind of learned that I was a kinky person. There's a story called Kevin Goes to Kink Camp, which is a 90-minute story of me being invited to this kink camp and me saying, I don't think so. And the person saying, hey, take a risk, using the show's tagline and me feeling like, oh God, I got to do this. And then having this like transformational sex weekend, 4 days of craziness, and coming back and really embracing, hey, you know what? I am polyamorous and kinky and yada yada, and really exploring that. And one of our editors was like, oh, you should hear this story that was told on one of the very first episodes of Risk, where this woman just like makes fun of kinksters the whole time. And I listened back to this thing and I was like, oh yeah, that is a very sex negative story. Let's get rid of that one. So stuff like that does happen. And then there are cases where we're like, you should really run this by a lawyer before you get up on stage or get on the mic with us in any way. We've lost some amazing stories that way, where a family member will be like, no, you can't do that. We allow people to go by fake names and to change lots of details to like protect other people. But yeah, it is. There are weird instances that arise and situations where you wonder, is this person stable? Are they mentally well enough to be sharing this story?
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't have fact checkers, so there's no way to know.
Yes.
If people are being honest.
Yeah, one of the most well-known stories on Risk is called A Hard Landing. This fella comes to New York from London and starts this torrid affair with this, beautiful woman who starts getting really, really sick, and there's just all sorts of bizarre drama, and eventually he starts seeing signs that she's just made up many of the aspects. She's faking her identity and her sickness and all that sort of thing. And fans have written in, oh my God, that seems so much like a movie. Is it really true? And we're like, well, we ask a lot of questions, but ultimately we just have to kind of trust people,
Yeah. Well, one of the questions I was thinking I wanted to talk to you about is, what is the role of truth in a good story?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that there's a difference between like accuracy and truth. I think that what you're ultimately going for is that the story is emotionally true. And that's really tricky too, because if you see the more classic, more formulaic sort of storytelling shows, one of the most off-putting things is that people will end with like a very kind of platitude, a very kind of like just liberal, happy, feel-good sort of ending that everyone can agree with and that sort of thing. And you walk away feeling like, it felt like that person kind of forced that resolution on that story.
Right.
So we will welcome people ending a story with something like, I wish I could say that I forgave my mother, but I still feel really fucked up about it, to be honest with you. Like, we're okay with a person ending a story like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like stories that don't have that tidy ending stick with me longer because they feel less packaged.
Yeah.
And more. I mean, isn't there something about a story that it's not over, right? That if a person's telling their story, by definition, they're still living it.
Yeah.
And it will change, as they age, right?
Yes, and a lot of people don't realize that. You know, we've had people come on the show 10 years later and want to kind of retell a story, and we've allowed it in some cases because the person feels like, yeah, my interpretation of that part of my life back then, I feel like was a bit off now that I look back at it. And yeah, like Mike Birbiglia, I've worked with his director a few times, Seth Barish, and he has a very interesting exercise that he'll have storytellers do where he'll say, okay, tell me a 20-minute story. You tell it, and then it'll be like, okay, now do it in 8 minutes. And you're like, oh, shit, all right, let me try that. And then he'll say, okay, now 2 minutes. And you try that. And he's trying to get you to recognize, oh, these things are extremely adaptable. And one can start to feel differently about, you know, what you thought the story meant a little while ago. There's a story called Man at Hawaii that I told about how when I was 17 years old, I went down to Peru to build schools for the poor down there with some Jesuits. And when I was working on the story, I saw that every plot point in the story was a particular Jesuit pushing me in a certain direction. And then realizing later, oh, they were grooming me to become a Jesuit. like I had all this profound experience in Peru, but then I look back and I'm like, oh, there was kind of a puppet master behind all that, and the end goal was for me to become a priest. And like, that is something that I might never have realized if I hadn't gone back and really tried to reconstruct that story. So I think there are a lot of things like that for a lot of people, where you remember it a certain way because it's convenient to you to remember it that way now. But then you go back and you can be rather challenged by some of it.
And then there's the deeper layer where you have to question now, am I remembering it the way I'm remembering it now because of some psychological bias? It's this dance, right? It's this sort of, Einsteinian relativity. Nothing is fixed. Right? Not what happened, not your memory of what happened, not your interpretation of your memory of what happened. There are all these different moving pieces.
Yeah. I told a story so I have a near-death experience story as well about almost drowning in the Colorado River. And I reshared it again recently, and I pretty much went with the script that I originally went with, like way back when I first shared it around 2010, and then shared the recording with my therapist, and he said, man, you do not have any compassion for yourself in that story. You are you're very mean to yourself in the way you tell that story. And that really kind of shook me. I was like, oh God, yeah, that's true. What would it be like to tell that story having a lot more compassion for myself? So this stuff is very interesting to experiment with that way.
Yeah. When I started the podcast, 2010 in my case, a year after you, one of the first people I interviewed was a Jungian analyst, an old dude. He was in his late 80s. and really fascinating guy. I don't remember how I met him. Maybe his wife was a friend of my aunt's or something. I don't remember. He lived in L.A., and I went to his house, and his father had written Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
Oh, wow.
And Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was one of these writing teams in the 20s, two guys, I forget the name, but very famous. Anyway, this guy told me the story about his parents' marriage, which was essentially an open marriage, but in the 20s. And his wife, or his mother, they lived together. It was his mother, his father, and his father's best buddy, who was his writing partner. And the mother sort of shifted from his dad to the other guy, but they all remained in the house together, and it was all cool. And he came home from college or the army or something, and they sat him down, and they're like, okay, look, you might notice I'm sleeping in his room now, and we're all cool with it, and everything's fine. This is the fucking 1920s, right? Or maybe 30s. And anyway, he told me that. He told me all these other stories, all these great, wonderful stories. And then the next day, he sent me an email. He said, Chris, I enjoyed our conversation so much. I told you things I've never told anyone. But it occurs to me that if my patients were to hear any of my stories, it might ruin their therapy.
Yeah.
And also people in my family don't know these different things. And I haven't, it wasn't about the marriage. It was all this other stuff that I've never said publicly. And he said, I don't mind if this is known, but would you mind just not posting this until I die?
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah. So I have no idea if he's still alive. I'm not calling every year, hey, is Paul home? Oh, he's dead. Really? Great.
But at some point you should check.
I guess. I don't even know if I still have the recording. I've changed hard drives and computers so many times. But anyway, the point of that is it gave me this. It reminded me of this line someone said: "You should always write posthumously."
Yeah. I went after I had that Kevin Goes to King Camp experience. It was funny because there was a fella there at the camp. He was like, "Oh, you're new here." He was like, "Well, let me tell you, it's a bit of a Pandora's box. You might find yourself, a year from now liking stuff you weren't prepared to like." And indeed, about a year after I started to have some really talk about Jungian, some really crazy role play sort of things happen, and tried out some of the more taboo stuff, and was a bit conflicted about it all. And I went to a proper sex therapist, and he used to tell me all the time, listen, you don't have to share all of these stories just because you've constructed this, persona of being the guy who helps people come out about stuff. You too can let things have a little bit of time and maybe publish some of this under a pseudonym or posthumously, some of the kinkiest stories and some of the stories where potential murder or something like that might be involved are situations where people will go by a fake name on the show, But I always think about that because, it's very hard for me to sit down and be like, okay, I'm really going to work on a story now, but probably won't release it until after I'm dead. It's such a motivating factor and we'll put it up next month, Yeah.
Well, I struggle a lot, having had this podcast for so long, with the line between secretiveness and discretion.
Yeah.
Right? Similar to you, I'm assuming you're motivated by a desire to destigmatize things. Mm-hmm. And here we are, two guys making a living independently. We're not working for a company. We're not pissing in a jar when we go to work. And, meeting with HR every month and all that stuff. So we're kind of unusual in having the freedom to say whatever the fuck we want.
Right.
And so then does that give us the responsibility to say things other people aren't allowed to say just to keep that space open, like hacking the weeds back in the garden a little bit?
Exactly. And I'm sure in the length of time that both of our podcasts have existed, I think for the most part, people on the right don't know about risk or don't listen to risk. I mean, we've over the years, we've had some like MAGA sorts of people write in insulting things or whatever, but it's just here and there. We will more often have to deal with people who were offended, left-leaning people who were offended about this or that. And sure. I've learned over the years that one of the most effective ways to deal with that is just to acknowledge it. Just to acknowledge, okay, this gal did not feel that she was raped in this situation. Another person who might have been also 16 years old and lived through that exact same guy feeling her up under the bed and yada yada, might feel that she was. So we're just acknowledging this is just this person's interpretation. Or sometimes, Halloween time, okay, we're not saying that exorcism is real, but this person believed that this happened. Right.
Yeah, one of the stories that really struck me, I think it's also in your book, I don't know, what's the book called?
It's just Risk. Yeah.
And there's some great stories in there. Dan Savage and God, I remember there. I just looked on the cover and I recognized like half the names. But there was one by a woman I'd never heard of, a black woman who described getting off on being like in a slave master situation with her white husband or boyfriend.
Yeah.
And man, that one, I went back and listened to her tell the story as well on your show. And that one was so powerful. And I imagine, the shit she must have gotten from every different angle to come out with that.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that she might have had to deal with more shit coming at her from other places. I think that Risk has done a really good job of situating itself so that people understand, okay, some of this stuff I might be uncomfortable with. Because, that story is called Slave by Melina Williams. And I think that she might have had to deal with more upset within the kink community or the black community. But the Risk community was pretty cool about it. There was also a story where two guys engage in scat play, and when I spoke to, and this was under this fellow went by a fake name, and when I spoke to him about it, I was like, okay, we can't just dive right into shit eating.
Never a good idea.
So I asked him, I was like, now give me more context for this relationship. And sure enough, this was like a love affair. This was, this was his introduction to the whole kink scene, where he was in his 20s, this other fellow was in his 40s, and they met at a spanking camp or something like that, and then and he takes you through these phases of their relationship, and the story ends up being about consent and negotiation.
Right.
And then the shit scene is at the very end, and I was like, okay, this is how this has to be constructed so that people feel like there are human beings here and they're having a really human experience. And sure enough, I was like, I was so worried when we published that episode. And instead, I got emails like a woman wrote to me, she's like, I am a Christian mother of 4 children in Iowa. I don't have a kinky bone in my body. And I can't believe you brought me to tears with that story. And I was so proud of that. Like, people still talk about that story today, but talk about it very fondly. So it really is, like you were saying, just how careful you are about how you're presenting things, you know, and the sorts of like caveats that you might have before or after to give people a little bit of aftercare, basically, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you find something that I've noticed in my own life is that I feel like I experience my life as narrative.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Do you feel that? Do you feel like because I'll be going through an experience and it'll be like, oh, I see the story taking shape around me somehow.
Yes, and that can be a real pitfall. You know what I mean? Like the Jungian analysts and narrative therapists are always talking about how you can really fuck yourself up by having story frames in place that are not serving you well. I talked about Kevin Goes to Kink Camp before. That is like the quintessential example of I'm at this kink camp for 4 days. No one told me there are no gay men. That no one told me, oh, yeah, there's lots of kink camps, and gay men only go to kink camps with other gay men. Other kink camps have everybody, trans, bi, everything, but gay men prefer to be just with gay men. So I'm at this kink camp, and after 4 days of like not having an orgasm, like I'm like, what am I going to do here? And so at the age of 40, what was that, 41? I played with a woman for the first time, and I was like, there's the end of my story. You know what I mean? Like, even as it was happening, I was like, this is it, you know?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting how if you experience life as narrative, I mean, was there something about the narrative power of that decision that led you into the decision?
Oh, exactly, you know? Exactly. Right. I think because there was a community bulletin board where you could post fantasies or desires, and I think that when I saw that, I was like, oh, this might lead to story material, okay. You know, and indeed it did.
So you actually solicited it. Yeah. Yeah, I remember I was in Topanga. I had a little rental house in Topanga near L.A. a couple years, 5 years ago or something, 3 years ago. There was terrible fires, and we were evacuated. And I was waiting, you know, like a week to go back, and I didn't know if my house had burned down.
Jeez, gosh.
And, you know, it wasn't my house. It was a rental, as I said. But, you know, my shit was there.
Yeah.
And I, you know, sort of cataloged in my mind, like, what – because I wasn't there when the evacuation happened, so I didn't get a chance to grab things.
Right.
You know, the photo albums or the old journals or whatever it was. So – I was thinking about, you know, what will I lose? What will be gone if that house is gone? But honestly, when I found out the house wasn't gone, I was disappointed because I valued the story more than the stuff.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, that is really interesting.
You know, it was a bummer. It's like, now I can't tell the story about how my house burned down, you know?
Yeah. It's so funny. When my husband and I broke up in 2010, we had been together for 9 years, and I insisted we go to a marriage counselor, not to get back together, which he didn't believe, but to like have closure to our marriage. And at one point, the therapist asked us to write a letter to one another, just expressing our feelings. And I wrote this letter that just brought me to tears, and then I brought it into the therapy session, and it brought the therapist to tears. And like, to me, it was a very important document of the end of this relationship. I can't find that goddamn letter for the life of me. And I've even asked my ex-husband, do you have a copy of it? He doesn't have it. And so it's the sort of thing where I'm like, okay, if I tell the story of my marriage, how do I reconstruct what I said in that letter? You know what I mean? Like, all of a sudden you're rewriting your own history. And
right.
yeah.
Or is the point that the letter is lost, as is the relationship? Is it a sand painting or something?
Exactly. Like, to me, I have such ADHD that this is a common thing of, am I just a moron for having forgotten something or lost something? Or is there significance in my having lost that thing? Yeah.
You said the word closure a second ago. That's something that always strikes me when people talk about wanting closure.
Yeah.
In a way, it kind of feels counterfeit to me in that it's like there is no closure of grief or sadness or loss, or you know what I mean? It doesn't end.
That's a very good
point. As you said it just now, it occurred to me that maybe what closure means is a way to end a story.
Yeah.
That you're like, okay, I'm still going to feel bad, but at least now I know how that story ends.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the movie Safe by Todd Haynes? Julianne Moore is a woman who is either paranoid that she's becoming more and more allergic to the world around her, or really is becoming more and more allergic to everything in the world around her. And she joins this cult-like commune where they're all obsessed with, keeping things as natural and to keep allergies away. And at the end of the movie, she's just looking in the mirror saying, I love myself, and with an expression on her or something like that, with an expression on her face that says, audiences were very pissed off. They were like, this movie doesn't have an ending. It didn't let us know whether or not we should feel okay about that cult or feel like cults are bad or yada yada. And Todd Haynes talked a lot after the movie was released about how, I feel like I would be, as an artist, as someone who cares about that character, I feel like I would be forcing upon her cults are bad or cults are good or whatever, whereas her actual experience still seems really ambiguous. And so that's how I ended it. And I just found that really courageous and fascinating on his part. It's funny that I say there were two things that I told my husband on the night we decided to get divorced. I said, one, I insist we remain friends to whatever extent we can. And we have. And two, let's go to a marriage counselor to, just talk about the past and everything. And so in those two requests, I was acknowledging, I think, wanting closure, but also not,
Yeah, good point. That's interesting. Do you think, how to phrase this? We're talking about how you and I both experience life as narrative in many ways, even in real time. And I think other people, it's probably more common for people to experience the narrative in retrospect. They look back and they see a story a year later or 5 years later.
Yeah.
Some people, I think, never see the story. Right? They're people who didn't grow up reading books and stories, or their parents didn't tell them stories when they were kids or whatever.
Yeah.
And they just don't have that narrative sense. But stories still happen to them, right?
Yeah.
Do you ever get people? I mean, I used to hitchhike a lot, and I see my podcast in some ways as a continuation of hitchhiking, where you just meet a random person and you're going to spend an hour or two with them, and you just sort of, pull it out of them, sort of the way you do with Risk, but you already know there's a story to be pulled, as opposed to me. I'm just throwing a line into a pond with no idea what's in there.
Right. Yeah.
But, I mean, don't you feel like there are a lot of people walking around with incredible stories and they have no idea?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why it's so frustrating that there's this storytelling scene. There's The Moth. There's people who listen to NPR. There's people who take a lot of creative writing sorts of classes and are drawn to storytelling shows. However, we are always like, wait a minute, this gal that was, only 16 years old and was rescued from being under the aegis of this pimp, she doesn't have the vocabulary and the education to construct a story the way we're used to hearing. And so that's one of the reasons I was talking about before, my feeling like, how can we honor the way that we've always wanted it to really be what the person felt and what the person really believed, not us constructing the story for them, but also get some of these stories from people who are not college educated or English isn't their first language, that sort of thing, because extraordinary things are happening to so many folks like that. Yeah, it's frustrating.
So were you a Spalding Gray fan?
Yeah. Yes. I was very daunted when I first saw Swimming to Cambodia. It was one of those things where when you see someone do like something that you want to do, it can be like, oh, God damn. That's
don't do it so well. You're stealing my niche, man.
Yeah. And that was very also sad when he killed himself. It was on the Staten Island ferry. He jumped off the Staten Island ferry. But he was extraordinary. Yeah. Fascinating guy.
He was one of the great storytellers of all time, I would say.
And I think that he really established what then kind of became the modern personal oral storytelling tradition that we're a part of, that the Moth really kind of codified eventually. Yeah.
Have you heard? There's an episode of This American Life where Spalding's widow, whose name is Kathy Russo, I think, tells a story about after he died, like when the night he disappeared and they didn't know what had happened to him. And then months later, I think they were at a house on Long Island, maybe Montauk, and this bird flew into the house. Have you ever heard that story?
No. I have to look that up now.
Yeah, I'll make a note to send you the link. It's a pretty powerful story, and it's kind of I don't know how to say it. It feels like the kind of story that Spalding would want to occur around his own death.
Yeah.
There's like a post-mortem kind of feeling to it. It's really beautiful. And you can tell she's not a storyteller by nature. Right. She's just telling you what happened.
Right.
And so it's very... I mean, we've talked so much about the artistry of telling a story, but there's also something very powerful about someone who you can tell isn't accustomed to telling stories.
Oh, absolutely.
There's like an innocence and a beauty to it.
So during the lockdown, we started doing Risk shows as live streams, and then we started asking people, why don't we have Risk fans get together and pitch us stories via live stream? All of a sudden we were like, oh, why aren't we using this technology to talk to the fans in other ways? And a gal pitched a story. She was like, okay, about 6 weeks into lockdown, sat down on the toilet and had a baby. She had no idea that she was pregnant. And I said, okay, we've got to get that story. We started talking, and she kept sending us drafts of the story. And I was like, okay, she's definitely not accustomed to storytelling, right? And so finally I said, why don't you record yourself telling this to a good friend or a family member or something like that? She told the story to her sister-in-law and recorded it and sent us in this recording that was about an hour long. And I said to our editors, fuck it. Let's run that. Like just this conversation between these two women, you definitely got the whole scope of the story. But it was in this very different way of just like listening to a couple of people sitting around the kitchen table having coffee. There was a fella named Joe Frank. Do you remember Joe Frank?
Yeah, I do. He's a columnist or San Francisco.
He had I think it was San Francisco. He had a late night show on some NPR affiliate, and actually, Ira Glass was his apprentice. That's how Ira Glass learned his radio stuff. But Joe Frank had a very experimental show where he would include long telephone conversations or Buddhist lectures he'd heard or people performing little sketches. And he would never inform you what it was you were even listening to. You know, you would think, is this fiction or true or what? And so, I mean, I think it would be very, very hard to pull that off other than in the very niche way that he did it. But we do love experimenting that way sometimes in order to get around the fact that, some people aren't polished storytellers. And it's kind of nice that they aren't, actually, you know?
It makes you mentioned Todd, the
Haynes
film director.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he did some very. I didn't see the film you mentioned, but I saw something else by him. I can't remember what it was called now, but it was very kind of raw and it felt experimental. And anyway, the connection is I was thinking about. Directors who tell stories in ways that involve real people.
Oh, yeah.
As opposed to just actors.
Yeah.
You know? And sort of your transition as well from acting to standing on stage as yourself is, you know, there's this interesting line between standing on stage pretending to be somebody versus standing on stage and just being yourself. It's and interestingly for you, it seemed to be more relaxing. Is that true?
Yes, it is. However, I've never stopped questioning it. You know, like when we first started Risk, the most common criticism of the show was, love the stories, hate Kevin Allison.
Those are just your friends, right?
Right. No, it was funny because you know how you look for the bad reviews, you know, like people who worked for me were like, look, there's like 15 really glowing reviews, and you focused on the 16th person saying, I hate Kevin Allison. Yeah. But it was always, you know, he laughs too much, he uses too much color in his vocalizations of things, and all these things that already I have always been self-conscious about. And I addressed it in a monologue on the show. I was like, yeah, part of the reason I do this is because my mother used to tell me, you use your hands too much. Don't run up the stairs like that. You look like a girl. Don't laugh. I was at a funeral for a 17-year-old kid when I was in my 30s, and everyone was sharing stories about the kid and crying, and my mom pulled me into the kitchen, and she was like, you're using too much facial expression.
Oh, God.
So, yeah. Like that. So when people are like, I can't stand your laugh or whatever, like that does make me self-conscious. And I feel like I've never stopped kind of examining, wait, am I acting or am I being authentic, you know? Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to go with. Like when we're standing, I've spent a lot of time standing on stage and being myself or a version of myself, right? Which I am on the podcast too. There's parts of my life. I've a very someone who's very close to me who heard me on the podcast before she ever met me. And at one point I said to her, so how does the real me compare to the guy you heard on?
Yeah.
And she said, you're the same person. There's just a lot more of you than you let on.
Yeah.
You know, I guess there's silliness and there are aspects of me that I don't share on the podcast. But, you know, interestingly, my father died 3 years ago, and at his funeral, you just reminded me of this, I didn't speak, and everyone else did. His brother was there, and my sister spoke, and my mom, and everybody. And as, you know, his son, and I look like him, and I sound like him, and you know, everyone says, you're just like your father. I mean, I'd answer the phone, and his own brother wouldn't know if it was me or his brother he was talking to. And one of the reasons I didn't speak was I felt like I don't know how to do this without pretending to be me speaking at my dad's funeral.
Right. Without putting on a little bit of a performance. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And not to put on a performance would have just been too raw. I would have just stood there and sobbed, So there's a, I guess what I'm trying to say is, there's a protectiveness to articulation. Funny, I didn't pronounce that word right. To being able to speak freely and to flow. There's a armor to that.
Oh, I'll tell you something. So around this past Christmas time, around Thanksgiving, Christmas, I suddenly became obsessed with poetry. And it's interesting because it reminded me of, right after the towers fell in 2001, I became obsessed with jazz. Like these moments when all of a sudden something very destructive and upsetting had happened, and I became obsessed with some art form. And with the poetry thing, like now I have like dozens and dozens and dozens of books of poetry because I went nuts on it. And I realized that part of what was happening was that I was tired of making sense. I was tired of trying to construct stories that did make emotional sense, and I felt like poems are a place where it can be anything. I mean, it doesn't have to make any sort of sense whatsoever. It's just, a purer form of expression, I guess. And so I think I was trying to scratch that itch of being able to be something other than articulate and making a good point. Because especially politically in the country today, like there's another place where I have a story about what has happened to, say, the Democratic Party since FDR, and all these stories that I have about here's what's really going on, and they don't do anyone any goddamn good. They don't change anything. Like, we continue to be a fucking mess, no matter what sense I try to make out of it and that I try to share with other people. It doesn't seem to make all that much of a difference. Things are just going to go the way they go, apparently,
Apparently. Yeah. That's the way things tend to go. Is the way they're going to go. Yeah. There's a Navajo expression I always come back to, which is, it's easiest to ride a horse in the direction it's going. Yeah.
It's like a very kind of Taoist idea of how do we get along with the way things are actually going.
You're not going to stop the fucking river, man. You're just going to flow downstream. I mean, politics, one way of looking at what's happening to America is that there's no shared story anymore.
Yes.
Right? Everyone's fracturing into their own narratives.
Yeah, and a lot of the folks on the left, like myself, feel very disillusioned. Like, it's not like I was, when I was in college in the early 90s, I was obsessed with Noam Chomsky and stuff like that. So it's not like I've been living in an illusion all these years. I've always been very, very critical of how things are going. But the past, 5-6 years, it's felt like, oh, shit, things are a lot less stable than I ever thought they were, and that's very jarring, very jarring. There are things like, for example, Twitter, where I really have to figure out the extent to which I can be on there because it's so upsetting to be there, It's such an addictive thing to go there, to stay in touch, to feel like you're a part of the conversation. But I'll realize, oh my gosh, that's almost like, drinking a bunch of alcohol every day or something, the way it leaves you feeling,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also wonder if those things aren't draining some of the energy that we actually need in true conversation, right? Like we're spending, I don't know, it's like sitting home watching porn, jerking off rather than going out and engaging with human beings.
That is, that's a very good analogy, I think. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I don't know. What's your earliest memory, Kevin?
Oh my God. So yeah, it's a whole story. I make a joke about it,
I'm not surprised.
I'm either 3.5 or 4 years old, maybe even 4.5, somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5, I would say. And I've been told that I already knew I loved boys' butts. But this is the moment when I remember knowing it, is my mom had this little, it wasn't a Hummel figurine, but it was some sort of like German hard rubber kind of figurine. And it was of a boy about my age, I guess, 3.5 or so, like that. Or maybe, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, he's in a onesie, like a blue onesie, and the trap door has fallen open and you can see his butt. I mean, they still make these things. It's like an archetypal image, I guess. And it was up on a shelf, and I saw this thing, and it was just like, I was just astounded. I grabbed a little chair so that I could climb up and get it. And when I got it, what I was feeling was that it was both very funny, hilarious, but also very exciting. I was clearly very turned on by it, but felt like the way to speak about it with other people would be how hilarious it was. So I grabbed it, and I ran upstairs, and I started telling my brothers and sisters in their various rooms. I have 4 brothers and sisters. Look at this. You can see his hiney. Isn't this hilarious? And they thought it was very funny. That I was known as Spaz. I was definitely an ADHD kid from the very beginning. So they were like, oh my God, he loves the butt on this little figurine. And then I thought I should go tell the Sullivans, the neighbors next door.
Maybe not.
So I felt like I was Paul Revere or something like that, spreading the important news. So I'm running downstairs, and I'm about to run outside with this little figurine when all of a sudden I am my feet are no longer touching the ground. I'm kind of like a cartoon character. My feet are still moving, but I'm not touching the ground. I've been pulled by my collar up off the ground, and my mom had grabbed me. And she turned me around, and she had this very, stern, not amused, and kind of like something very disagreeable was happening, in her opinion, right? And I said, look, Mom, isn't it funny? You can see his hiney. And she said, I'm just going to take this and put it somewhere safe, and you go back to your room or something like that. And I just felt like kind of crushed and definitely felt shamed, right? Like I had I had been excited about something that was embarrassing or something like that.
Right.
And when I was leaving to go back up into my room, I turned my head and I saw her throwing it in the garbage can.
Oh.
And so that is, as far as I know, my first memory. I've always wondered if I could tap into another one, if I did one of those like EMDR things, because this is one of those cases, this particular story, it's one of those things where you're like, that seems like such a story. Like that feels like very much like an origin story of like that wound that so many people have about their sexuality, right?
Yeah.
I grew up in a very Republican, very Catholic, Cincinnati, Ohio, very white, very sex negative. Cincinnati was actually famous for the Mapplethorpe trial, the Larry Flint trial. When hair came to town, everyone was thrown out by the police, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I grew up very aware that I was very attracted to other boys. And by the time I was 5 or so, I was terrified of going to kindergarten because I thought, if I'm all day surrounded by other kids, they're going to pick up on it, that I have this thing inside me. I'll just be too exposed to too many kids and someone will pick up on it. And sure enough, first day of kindergarten, we're in this single file line to go into our class. And some kid points at me and says, "Why is your hair orange?" And another kid says, "It's not orange, it's red. Red like the head on the dick of a dog." And they started laughing at me and making fun of me. And you know what I was thinking at that moment? I was like, thank God they're focusing on the hair. I was relieved because I was like, oh, God, yeah, they let them focus on shit that I don't give a shit about.
That's fascinating that you already knew not only that you were attracted to boys, but that it was something to hide.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you something. When my parents were celebrating, I think it was like their 40th wedding anniversary, I went back home to Cincinnati, and they threw this big party, and it included people who used to live next door came to the party.
The Sullivans?
Yes. Yeah. And Mrs. Sullivan said to me, it was the first time I was drinking alcohol with my parents' friends, right? So it was like, I was in my 20s or whatnot. She pulled me aside and she said, now that we're able to talk about these things, how old do you think you were when I first had to stop you from going after my son in a sexual way? And I was stunned that she was saying this. But I said, well, I do remember you catching us when we were 5 down in your basement. I said to her son, wouldn't it be funny if we took off all our clothes and ran around the basement listening to Walt Disney's Cinderella record? It was the mice singing, Cinderella, Cinderella. And she caught us. And that was a very, very shameful moment as well, right? But so years later, I'm at the 40th wedding anniversary of my folks, and she comes up to me. She's like, how old do you think you were when I first had to stop you from doing that sort of thing? I said 5 and remembered that incident. She said, no, 1. She was like, you were trying to get my son's diapers off when you were both still in diapers. So it's really funny. I mean, when people talk about kids' sexuality, like for example, this whole "don't say gay" thing. Some kids are completely oblivious and aren't putting the pieces together. They might have they might grow up into being people with lower libidos or whatnot, or just not be able to access that at that time. But then other kids, I think, are very aware of it on some level and are aware, hearing things like "don't say gay" is going to be traumatic for kids like that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did her son turn out to be gay?
No. In fact, another kind of like a person who became a little bit like off the grid, like, out in nature, might be a park ranger somewhere or something like that. And I think about that all the time. That's another thing I heard you and Daniele Bellelli talking about on his podcast, was this fantasy of leaving a lot of this society behind, and finding a bunch of friends and buying a big plot of land and trying to live a little bit more communally and whatnot. I think about that because things are just so crazy, and there's talk about stories. There's this part of me that wants to escape, move to another country or move to the wilderness or something like this. And there's another part of me that's like, that story is just a fantasy and probably wouldn't solve a lot of the things that are making you want to do that. But it's hard to know,
Yeah, and there are stories embedded within stories like Russian dolls, right? So it might solve your personal conundrum, but it's not solving the conundrum of your society or your family or your friends. We might find a piece of wood to grab onto when the ship sinks, but the ship's still going down.
Yeah.
It's very strange. Hey, Kevin, you're great. I really enjoy hanging out with you.
Yeah, me too.
Have we ever been in the same room together, or has it always been through a computer?
It's always been through a computer because you've done Risk Live before, but I think it was in Los Angeles, and I wasn't there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, next time I'm in New York, I'll drop you a line. It would be great to just breathe the same air, as long as COVID isn't happening.
Indeed.
Thank you for doing this, man.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to stop recording here. All right.